Welcome back to our second day of e-learning. Um, we are going to finish up today where we left off yesterday, which is installing the dictators all across Europe and Asia. So we left off talking about Mussolini and his rise to power in Italy. The next great world power that we are fix my collar here, that we're going to discuss today is going to be Emperor Hirohito and his military commander Tojo. So we see that Japan has rapidly industrialized. In the early 1900s, they have definitely felt like they were behind the curve when it comes to industrial advancement, and so the Emperor Hirohito, is just doing everything he can to modernize the Japanese economy. It is his military commander Tojo who is going to rise to power rapidly within Japan. Tojo will rather easily convince Hirohito that if Japan is going to make itself a world power, it most definitely needs to expand its military might and is going to need more resources and living space for its people. Remember, Japan is, uh, it's really a series of islands, but rather small islands. And if you want to be an industrial power, you most certainly have to have resources, which is something Japan doesn't have a lot of. They absolutely need oil, and that's going to be important later because of a play that America makes to try and manipulate Japan. And so Tojo convinces Hirohito that Japan must expand if it is to survive. And this means that Tojo and his followers are going to, gain power within the military. Most historians believe that by this point, Tojo is the one that's really running things in Japan. Japan, emboldened by Italy's, just absolute disregard for the traditional Western powers, Japan follows that lead and will start to renounce the things that it thinks it's holding its empire back. Number one is the Washington Naval Conference. Japan absolutely cannot expand around the world if it does not have a strong military, and so the Japan will back out and is going to build one of the most formidable navies in the entire world. And again, if it wants to be able to get resources, we've talked about all the way back to Captain Alfred Mahan, an absolutely strong navy is required for that. Japan will withdraw from the League of Nations. It views the League of Nations as a Western contrivance to, uh, you know, keep the top tier powers on top and to limit the ability of other countries to rise. And then once those things are out of the way, Japan will invade Manchuria, which is in the northern sections of China. This is really when World War II starts. Most Western historians will say World War II really starts when Germany invades Poland. But for most of the world, World War II really starts when Japan invades China. Now, Japan is going to have some pretty quick success in the invasion of China. You can see a map here in the northern regions. You see, Manchuria. Japan had already been in Korea, and it will from Manchuria kind of sweep down into the center part of China. China is not prepared for what Japan is about to do. The Chinese have been fighting a civil war for some time now. The nationalist government in China is led by a guy by the name of Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek does receive support from the United States because he is fighting a communist revolution in China, led by a guy by the name of Mao Zedong. And so, because the Civil War has been going on for some time now, China is weak. And when Japan invades, the Chinese just are already exhausted. The nationalist Chinese, which is again Shanghai Shek, and the communist Chinese, which is Mao Zedong, are both going to call a truce. And it's at this point that Mao does something really intelligent, the communist. He retreats into the countryside and into the mountains and essentially lets Shanghai Shek fight the Japanese on his own. And so it's pretty much just the nationalists that are fighting off this Japanese invasion. Mao and the communists are going to use this as an opportunity to resupply, retrain, and recruit. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek doesn't have that opportunity. He's trying to stop the Japanese invasion. And so as Chiang Kai-shek keeps getting weaker and weaker, what we see is Mao Zedong is getting stronger and stronger. This is going to have an impact later on because when World War II is over, Chiang Kai-shek is on the winning side, right? And he should, be celebrating. Except it's at this point that Mao Zedong comes back with a vengeance, and a worn-out Chiang Kai-shek is relatively easily overthrown, where he will then flee to Taiwan. It's that little island in the south of the map there. And that will have ramifications all the way up until today. The remnants of the Shek government are still in Taiwan. The remnants of the Mao government are still in China, and they hate each other. Go figure. But either way, the Japanese are going to see some pretty early successes here. The rape of Nanking will be happening at this time, where the Japanese army just brutally takes over Nanking. It's going to kill, the majority of the men. There's going to be systematic rape of the women, and again, that's all part of this like growing nationalist movement that devalues the life of the other, right? And the Japanese are going to just kind of brutally take over, and they're going to justify that because they think that they are in fact racially superior to the Chinese and the Koreans. And so you can see pictures here of soldiers taking bayonet practice using prisoners of war. That's how absolutely brutal the campaign in China is going to be. I bring this up just to point out that Hitler's not the only monster during World War II. We're going to see the Japanese, the Germans doing some pretty brutal things. And even our ally in the Soviet Union is going to, be doing things that we just, even in times of war, think are unacceptable. And so there you have it. The next great, I shouldn't say great, excuse me. The next dictator that we're going to discuss today is going to be Francisco Franco in Spain. Franco is not a communist. He is a fascist. Again, not much of a difference between the communists and the fascists when we're talking about their totalitarian dictatorships. Franco's not going to be as totalitarian as, say, a Joseph Stalin or an Adolf Hitler, but you get the point. Franco is going to be involved in the civil war in Spain in 1936. This is mostly a battle. At first it's a battle with the nationalists, and then the nationalists are kind of taken off the board, and then becomes a battle between the fascists and the communists. The communists are going to be supported by the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That is, again, Russia or the Soviet Union. I know that's a lot of names to keep straight, but that's communist dictatorships for you. The fascists are going to be supported by, you guessed it, Italy and Germany. And so what we're seeing with the Spanish Civil War is the world is kind of picking sides, and clearly the fascists are sticking together. And then, Italy, Germany, and Spain start to work together. Now, Spain's not going to take part in World War II because they've got too many domestic problems. Franco's just never able to consolidate power strong enough to be able to, exert his influence on the larger world. But what ends up happening with the fascists is, it's going to start to put Italians and Germans in the same room together. And the Italian and German governments are going to start to coordinate in trying to help Spain. And so, which means that Mussolini and Hitler are going to become BFFs. And that's going to be kind of the beginning of the formation of the Axis powers in World War II. America has a policy of non-intervention in this civil war, and so we're going to kind of stay out of it. Although American volunteers will head over to Spain to try and help fighting on both sides. Actually, Ernest Hemingway was one of the famous Americans that is going to head to Spain. And so we see as this war plays out, the fascists will be victorious. They overthrow first the democratic government, then they fight the communists. They will win there as well, although that will be a long, sustained campaign against the communists that will last throughout World War II. The democratic government has just lost its appeal to many Europeans because of the poor economy, and so they're turning to more radical forms of government. The interesting thing here is that during Spain, and the only reason we're really talking about Spain is because Spain's not involved in World War II, is because of the way Hitler uses Spain to his advantage. At this point, Hitler is in power. He is remilitarizing Germany, and he thinks he's learned his lessons from World War I. He recognizes that trench warfare is a type of warfare that he can't possibly win. And so he's coming up with new strategies. He and his generals are coming up with new strategies to make sure he doesn't fall into another World War I trench warfare situation. And so he's experimenting with what will later become blitzkrieg tactics. And so he's sending the German army and air force into Spain to help Franco. And they're learning very valuable lessons that they're later going to apply in World War II. Hitler in Germany, again, just like World War I, the Germans, because they embrace education and because they embrace technology, they really kind of learn their lessons before everybody else. And so they're experimenting with these new strategies in Spain. They're figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and then they're going to apply that later in the rest of mainland Europe, which will give the Germans a very distinct advantage. All right. Excuse me. Our next major dictatorship that we're going to discuss today is going to be the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union, if you will. They are the former Russian government after the Bolshevik Revolution. Joseph Stalin was an extremist student of Lenin. Lenin is the guy that brought us the Bolshevik Revolution. Stalin really rises to power in kind of a unique way. Lenin just Lenin and his right hand man, Trotsky, neither one of them really like Lenin. Lenin is not an intellectual. He's, not one of the kind of elite thinkers in the communist movement. And so, because of that, Lenin just kind of never really trusts Stalin. But Stalin's useful. And so, Lenin wants to take advantage of that. So, Stalin's useful because he's a thug. And so, if you're going to throw a revolution, you need thugs. Like, you just do. You need somebody who has a loyal following of young men willing to commit violence. And Stalin has that in spades. So Stalin starts his career with the Communist Party during the Bolshevik Revolution, essentially as a bank robber. He runs around the country robbing banks, taking from the rich and giving to the poor, which is, the whole idea behind the communist movement. And so he's robbing these banks to help fund the Bolshevik Revolution. He will get arrested while he's doing that during the Bolshevik Revolution. And when he gets arrested, Lenin for a time thinks, well, maybe I should just leave him in Siberia, in the gulags, which are Russian prisons, and which are terrible, by the way. And Lenin, after the communists win in the revolution, Lenin quickly realizes that Stalin has too many powerful friends, and so he knows that if he leaves Stalin locked up, that eventually those friends who are again prone to violence will not be happy, and so he's got to placate them. So Stalin gets freed, and Lenin knows that that's not enough. He's got to give Stalin a position of power within the communist government, but he doesn't want to make Stalin too powerful because he doesn't trust him. And so he makes Stalin the secretary of the Communist Party. And so, and I don't mean secretary the way that we use the word secretary today, like executive assistant. I mean, his job in the Communist Party is to kind of organize the party, make sure that the hierarchical structure is maintained, and his job is to kind of hire the middle management people within the Communist Party. And, it's the least powerful position that Lenin can give Stalin without actually being overtly disrespectful to Stalin. And, Stalin's not happy about it, but he sees an opportunity that he quickly takes advantage of. He recognizes that one of the most important things that you could do in a revolution is to make sure that you have those mid-level management guys on your side, because those are the boots on the ground. They're the ones that do all the work. And so he starts to hire people essentially based on loyalty and loyalty alone. And he essentially goes to people and says, "Hey, would you like a job with the Communist Party? It's a lucrative job, and I don't care really whether or not you're qualified. I don't care if you steal from the government or from the people. I don't care about any of that as long as you're loyal to me." And so he builds up this, pretty astounding power base uh, with his followers. Many people are getting rich off of the appointments that he's made, and so those people have become really kind of loyal to Stalin. And so when the time is right, and when Lenin dies, Stalin makes his move, and he essentially says, "I'm in charge now," even though clearly he's not the next in line. But because he's bought off so many of the average guys within the Communist Party, we see that there's just no other option. The party would fall apart without him, and so Stalin is able to take over. He overthrows Lenin's successor, Leon Trotsky, in 1929. Trotsky's forced to flee the country, and then Stalin takes over. Now, when Stalin takes over, he really starts to begin his purges, and these purges are going to have disastrous results for Russia, for the Soviet Union. He immediately starts to build agricultural communes, and so excuse me, he will collectivize the farms and say, these gigantic landowners, you're no longer allowed to exist. They divvy up the plots, and he starts to institute his first 5-year plans. Um, and while he's doing that, it's not just about distributing income, it's also about eliminating competition. And so he immediately starts to go after anybody he perceives as a threat. And what he perceives as a threat is competence. Anybody who's doing well is essentially challenging his authority. If you're the local farmer, and people are, and you're very successful and people are dependent upon you for food, those people are going to be loyal to you and not to Joseph Stalin. And so he immediately starts going after all those people. He will eliminate school teachers. He will kill business leaders, and I mean he will kill them. Some of them will end up in what is later referred to as the Gulag Archipelago, which is a series of Russian prisons. They're work camps where essentially, people will be used as slave labor and worked to death if they're not just outright shot. During these purges, Joseph Stalin's going to kill anywhere from 20 to 60 million people. And it's important the people that he does kill, because he's essentially going to send the Soviet Union back into the Stone Age, because he kills all the intellectuals, the college professors, anybody that can intellectually make an argument against him will be killed. Business leaders, you create jobs and people are loyal to you, so he kills you. Successful farmers. What he does to the Ukraine is absolutely crazy. He's going to start a famine essentially that's going to kill roughly 6 million Ukrainians. He's just going to take their food from them and give it to the cities and leave nothing left for them. The kulaks, not to be confused with the gulags, which are the prisons. The kulaks are people within the Soviet Union. They're some of the most successful farmers in the country. He's going to round them up and kill them because, again, he doesn't want people to be dependent upon them for food. He wants people to be dependent upon the government for food. And so, this is going to cause a food shortage in the country, and it's going to kill, millions of people across the country. He will, once he takes out the intelligentsia and then goes after the successful farmers and businessmen, then he's going to go after the police. He's going to kill the top leadership in the police structure. You never want to go after the police first because you need them to kill the other people. And so, during the beginning stages of these purges, he essentially tells the police that they're safe as long as they do his bidding. But then once the major portion of the purges are over, then Stalin sends his military after the police to purge the police. So all the top leadership, I mean, if you're a grunt, you probably survived, but if you're in any kind of leadership within the police, you probably end up dead or in prison. Then after that, because if you're going to go after the police, you really have to use your military to do that. So after he's done purging the police, he will then go after the military again. And he is not necessarily interested in taking out the low-ranking soldiers. He goes after the generals and the leaders, all the officer corps, anybody he thinks might be a threat to him, he has killed or sent to prison, and which eventually is a death sentence. And so this is going to have a big impact later, because when the Soviet Union realizes that war is inevitable, it just will not be prepared. The Soviets, essentially, because of Stalin's purges, have killed all the people that are prepared to actually fight a war. And so you see Stalin will eventually have to do the one thing that he really doesn't want to do, which is, ally himself, at least temporarily, with Adolf Hitler, because he knows he's not ready to fight a war. Uh, excuse me. So, the military and secret police are, in his corner after the purges. It becomes really clear very quickly that anybody who stands in Stalin's way ends up dead. The agriculture has been collectivized, and all economic activity will be placed under the government's control. Um, all of these people, all of this has resulted in, millions and millions killed. It's hard to really keep track. The estimates really range between 20 and 60 million people. I've heard even larger estimates for the number of people that Joseph Stalin kills during his time in power. Suffice it to say that he kills a whole lot of people, anybody that he perceives as a threat. The Soviet Union will not immediately be recognized by the United States. We don't like them because they're communist. But in 1933, FDR realizes the writings on the wall, that the Soviet Union is going to be here to stay. Excuse me. But more importantly, what he realizes is communists and fascists hate each other. Stalin and Hitler hate each other. And as Hitler's making more noise in Europe, it becomes clear that we need as many allies as we can get. And the Soviet Union being right at the back door of Germany, it makes sense to have some sort of relationship with them. Again, if you can force Germany to fight on two fronts, you got a shot. And so the Soviet Union is a very vital part of that strategy. The Soviet Union, after the agricultural system is collectivized, Stalin starts what are referred to as his 5-year plans. You'll hear most communist nations talk about 5-year plans. The 5-year plan is just a strategy that the government uses to encourage production, set production goals. And so essentially they say, look, if last year you produced 1 million bushels of corn, Russia, I didn't want to use potatoes as the example, but, of wheat or corn or whatever it is, then on year 2, the expectation is that you produce 1.5 million bushels, and then year 3, you produce 2 million bushels, and so on and so forth. And initially, in almost every single communist country, the first 5-year plan works. And it works, generally speaking, because you're taken from the rich, these gigantic landowners, you give it to the poor, and there's this increase in productivity amongst the workers because it's their own land for the first time, and generally the production goals are set pretty low. But then we see, after the first 5-year plan, you see this in countries like Cuba and North Korea, and even Venezuela, who's not really communist but socialist today. You start to see these economic plans starting to fail, and for a number of reasons. One, the production goals are set too high, and so because they're set so ridiculously high, it encourages cheating and stealing. Because keep in mind, I mean, Stalin is no sweetheart here. If you don't meet your production goals, you can end up in prison or dead. And so if by year 3, you have to produce 3 million bushels of corn and you only produce 2.5, guess what you're doing? You're probably going to your neighboring collective farm and stealing 500,000 bushels, because You'd rather see that guy in prison than you. And so, there starts to be some corruption involved in the process, but also you got to keep in mind the personal motivations here. In 5 years, that first year you were producing, 1 million bushels of corn, and by year 5, you've got to produce 4 or 5 million bushels of corn. Remember, you're not getting paid for the increase in your work. That's just a thing that's expected of you. And so, what you start to see is that these systems really start to fail. And keep in mind also, all of the real serious farmers, Stalin rounded them up and killed them. And so, you've got people farming that've never farmed before, that have no interest in being a farmer, because again, the Communist Party makes all the economic choices for you. And so you've got people who don't know what they're doing being put in charge because they're, not because they're good at what they do, but because they're loyal to the Communist Party. And so, these kind of things are just doomed to failure. And by the way, these 5-year plans don't just happen on the farms, they also happen in industry. You know, Joseph Stalin very much wants to be an industrial power. And so, he starts to, have his factories produce tanks and, trains and trucks and things of that nature. And so what you start to see is the same kind of thing with these 5-year plans, is that the workers will meet their first few years of production goals, but then all of a sudden the production goals around year 4 or 5, they start to be so high that, these, say for instance, these truck factories will produce trucks that just don't run. And so they'll just, the government will send in at the end of the year somebody to come in and count the cars to make sure you met the production quota. And there'll be cars out on the lot that don't have engines in them, or maybe have an engine that doesn't work, or, this one has an engine, but that one doesn't have a transmission, or, this one has an engine and a transmission, but not a radiator. And so, because the inspector's not going to start all the trucks. That becomes a very large problem for the Soviet Union later. First, like, what sense does it make to have a truck that doesn't work? In capitalism, that would never work, because if your company goes out of business if you make a product that doesn't work. And so, but in communism, it doesn't work that way, right? You stay in business as long as the government tells you to stay in business. So you're producing, millions of trucks and only half of them work. Well, what's the point of that? But when it starts to come to war materials, that's when it's going to be a real problem. When World War II breaks out and the Soviet Union starts fighting, what you're going to see is, their soldiers are going to be given guns and tanks and, ammunition that just don't work. They don't work because the factories are thrown together super sloppy, because they just have to meet these 5-year quotas. And if they don't, they end up dead. And so, they're looking out for number one, trying to stay alive, producing weapons that don't work. And then when the Soviet soldiers get on the battlefield, just figure it out. It just ends up being a really bad situation. All right. Well, that is where we are going to end our lecture for the day. Hopefully, you've taken good notes. Remember, when we get back from this quarantine, I will be checking those notes. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I am going to try and figure out how to sign out. I hope everybody's doing well. Remember, wash your hands.